Imagine you are the commandant of the most secure prison in the Third Reich. Your fortress sits on a jagged cliff, towering 75 meters above the river Mulde below. You have more guards than prisoners. You have blinding searchlights, layers of barbed wire, and machine guns trained on every single exit. You are absolutely certain that no one can get out. But you are wrong, because right under your nose, hidden behind a false wall in the attic, your prisoners are not just digging a tunnel, they are building a glider, a real man-carrying aircraft made of stolen floorboards and sleeping bags, designed to launch from the roof of your prison and fly to freedom. This is not the plot of a Hollywood movie. This is the true story of Colditz Castle. The Germans believed they had built the ultimate cage for the Allied forces' most dangerous troublemakers, but they made a catastrophic calculation. By gathering all the escape artists, genius engineers, and master thieves from across Europe and locking them up in one single location, the Nazis did not stop the escapes. They industrialized them. What followed was one of the most unique chapters of World War II. It was a battle of intellects, fought not with tanks and artillery, but with fake mustaches, papier-mâché dummies, and a level of creativity that the rigid German bureaucracy simply could not understand. This is the story of how the human spirit refused to be caged, how wit defeated brute force, and how the most formidable prison in Germany became the greatest embarrassment of the war. To understand the magnitude of this failure, we must first look at the logic behind the creation of this super prison. The German High Command was tired of chasing the same officers across the countryside. In the early years of the war, capturing an Allied officer was easy, but keeping him was difficult. These men were driven by a code of duty that mandated they must try to escape and return to the fight. So, the Nazis came up with a solution that seemed brilliant on paper. They would take all the bad apples, the serial escapers, and the most rebellious troublemakers from every other camp in Germany and put them all in one basket. They believed that by concentrating their resources on this one location, they could watch them 24 hours a day. Colditz Castle was chosen for a reason. It was a medieval fortress built on a rock outcrop in Saxony. Its outer walls were 2 meters thick. The inner courtyard was cobbled and surrounded by buildings that rose 6 stories high. Beyond the walls, the cliff dropped sharply down to the river Mulde. It looked like something out of a Gothic nightmare, designed to crush the hope of anyone who entered. The garrison of guards vastly outnumbered the prisoners. They conducted multiple roll calls every day. They used microphones to listen for tunneling. They had dogs, searchlights, and a paranoia fueled by the reputation of the men they were guarding. But this is where the German strategy backfired spectacularly. By gathering the most determined, intelligent, and resourceful officers from Britain, France, Poland, Holland, and Belgium into one place, they did not create a prison. They created an academy of escape. Think about it. In a normal prison camp, you might have one expert forger, one engineer, and maybe one man who speaks fluent German. In Colditz, you had dozens of each. The prisoners called it the bad boys' camp. The Germans called them Deutschfeindlich, which means hostile to Germany. But the atmosphere inside was not one of despair. It was electric. It was a hive of industry. Because these officers were not forced to work like the enlisted men in other camps, they had one luxury that is dangerous to a captor: time. And they used every second of it to wage a psychological war against their jailers. The British contingent, led by officers like Pat Reed, turned escape into a high-stakes sport. They realized early on that they could not simply dig a hole and leave. The castle was built on solid rock. Any successful escape would require complex engineering, master disguise, or theatrical deception. To manage this chaos, they formed an official escape committee. This was necessary because, in the early days, There were so many people trying to break out that they were actually tripping over each other. You had situations where a British team would be digging a tunnel, only to break into a tunnel that the French were digging from the other direction. The committee brought order to the madness. You had to submit your plan, get it approved, and you would be given resources. And the resources were incredible. The prisoners turned the castle into a factory. They made compasses out of melted gramophone records and magnetized razor blades. They forged travel documents using ink made from crushed pills and soot. They carved official German stamps out of rubber shoe heels so perfectly that even the Gestapo could not tell the difference. They knitted civilian clothes from unraveled wool blankets and dyed them with beet juice or boot polish. But their greatest weapon was their attitude. The British officers treated the German guards, whom they called goons, with a mix of mockery and aristocratic disdain. They engaged in a practice known as goon baiting. The goal was to harass, confuse, and exhaust the guards to the point where they would make mistakes. During roll calls, the prisoners would move around, change places, or hide, making the count impossible. A roll call that should have taken 10 minutes would drag on for hours, with the German commandant screaming in frustration while the British officers stood there with innocent smiles. One of the most legendary examples of this psychological dominance involved a French officer named Lieutenant Beaulieu. The Germans were obsessed with numbers. If the number of prisoners on the roll call matched the number in the book, they were happy. So, when a prisoner escaped, the remaining men had to cover for him until he was far away. The French created dummy prisoners, mannequins with papier-mâché heads painted to look like real people. During the evening lineup, in the dim light, 2 officers would hold a dummy between them, moving its arms and swaying it as if it were a tired prisoner. The German guards would count the dummy, satisfied that everyone was present. These dummies worked so well that on one occasion, a specific dummy was counted as present for weeks after the actual man had vanished. This atmosphere of constant trickery meant the guards were always on edge. They saw ghosts in every shadow, and the prisoners exploited this paranoia. One of the most audacious early attempts was carried out by a British officer named Airy Neve. He realized that trying to sneak out at night was suicide because of the searchlights. The best time to escape, he reasoned, was right after a theatrical performance in the prison theatre, when the guards were distracted. But he didn't dress as a civilian. He dressed as a German officer. Neve and a partner spent weeks creating uniforms that were masterpieces of tailoring. They used cardboard to make the stiff peaks of the caps and painted them with polish. They made insignias out of coloured paper. Under the stage lights of the theatre, they changed into these uniforms. Neve put on a monocle and assumed the arrogant posture of a high-ranking German commissioner. They boldly walked out of the theatre, marched across the courtyard, and approached the main gate. The sentries, seeing the uniform and the confident strut, hesitated. In the German military, you did not question a superior officer. The guard opened the gate. They walked through. They approached the second gate. The guard saluted. They walked through. They were nearly free. It was only at the final outer perimeter that a sharp-eyed guard noticed that the colour of the uniform was slightly off under the harsh glare of the guardhouse lights. They were captured, but the damage was done. The Germans were humiliated. 2 prisoners had nearly walked out of the front door of a maximum security fortress simply by pretending to be the bosses. This failure sent shockwaves through the camp administration. It proved that walls and machine guns were useless if the enemy could simply hack the minds of the guards. And this was just the beginning. The attempts that followed would become even more elaborate, involving ghosts, disappearing rooms, and eventually, the laws of aerodynamics. The failure of the German uniform escape did not discourage the prisoners. It only forced them to refine their methods. If the front gate was too risky, they would have to go under the walls or over them in ways the guards could never anticipate. But tunneling through Colditz was a nightmare of engineering that would have daunted professional miners, let alone starving prisoners working with stolen spoons and bed slats. The castle was built on hard rock, and even if you could hack through the stone, you faced a logistical problem that killed more escape plans than the guards ever did. The problem was the dirt. When you dig a tunnel, you create debris. Tons of it. In a standard prisoner of war camp, you can scatter the soil in the gardens or drop it down your trouser legs while walking around the yard. But in Colditz, the courtyard was paved with cobblestones. There were no gardens. There was nowhere to hide the earth. So, the British and French officers looked up. The castle had vast empty attics under its high slate roofs. The prisoners realized that if they could access these attics, they could store the debris there. They formed human chains, passing buckets of rocks and soil up through false ceilings and hidden hatches. Over the years, they moved so much earth into the roof spaces that the ceilings in the German quarters below actually began to bow and crack under the immense weight. The Germans constantly patched the cracks, grumbling about the old architecture, never realizing that literally tons of the prison's foundation were hanging right above their heads. With the disposal problem solved, the tunneling reached an industrial scale. The French officers, who were master engineers, constructed a tunnel that became legendary for its complexity. It started in the clock tower and went down a majestic 30 meters through solid masonry. They wired it with electric lights stolen from the corridors. They built an air pump system, made from bellows and tin cans, to stop the diggers from suffocating. This tunnel took 8 months of back-breaking labour. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, driven by the singular hope of freedom. They calculated their trajectory perfectly. They dug outwards, under the chapel, under the walls, and prepared to breach the surface on the side of the cliff, beyond the barbed wire. But the tragedy of Colditz was that sometimes brilliance was not enough. On the very day they planned to break through, the Germans happened to be conducting routine maintenance on the castle's outer foundations. A German workman heard a strange tapping sound coming from beneath the rock. He alerted the guards. They dug down and broke into the tunnel. The French officers, who were waiting inside with their fake documents and civilian clothes, found themselves staring down the barrel of a German Luger. 8 months of work was destroyed in seconds. The psychological blow was devastating, but in the spirit of Colditz, the French simply shrugged, opened a bottle of wine they had been saving for the victory, and began planning the next one immediately. While the French dug down, the British specialized in audacity. They realized that the Germans were creatures of habit. They patrolled the same routes at the same times. Major Pat Reed, the man who would later write the famous history of the castle, orchestrated one of the most daring breakouts by exploiting a blind spot in the German defences. He noticed that during the night, a searchlight swept across the exercise yard, but for a few seconds it left a patch of shadow near the Kommandantur, the German headquarters. Reed and 3 others decided to break out of the prisoners' quarters, cross the roof of the German kitchen, and drop down into this tiny window of darkness. It was a plan that required athletic precision. They had to pick the lock of a window, climb across a sloping roof in full view of the sentry towers, and time their movements to the rhythm of the searchlight. One slip on the wet tiles meant death. On a cold October night in 1942, they made their move. They crawled silently over the kitchen roof. The searchlight beam swung past them, missing them by inches. They dropped down into the yard, cut through the barbed wire fence, and slipped into the moat. By the time the sun rose and the Germans screamed for roll call, Pat Reed and his team were miles away. They eventually made it all the way to Switzerland. It was a stunning humiliation for the commandant. 4 of his high-security prisoners had vanished into thin air, proving that the castle was leakier than a sieve. But for those left behind, the game had to continue. As the war dragged on, the attempts became more bizarre. There was the famous mattress escape. A prisoner named Flight Lieutenant Dominic Bruce, a man of small stature, realized that the prisoner's dirty laundry was taken out of the castle by truck to be washed in the town. The laundry was collected in large, square sacks. Bruce had his friends pack him inside one of these sacks, surrounding him with dirty sheets and towels to soften the shape. The Germans threw the sack onto the truck, piled other heavy sacks on top of him, and drove him out of the gates. Imagine the physical endurance required. He was crushed under the weight of the laundry, unable to breathe properly, bouncing around in the back of a truck, waiting for the vehicle to stop. When the truck arrived at the laundry facility in the town, the drivers went for a smoke break. Bruce cut his way out of the sack using a razor blade, climbed out of the truck, and walked away. He was recaptured weeks later trying to board a ship in Danzig, but the legend was born. The Germans were furious. They had to start stabbing every laundry sack with bayonets before it left the castle, a practice that ruined a lot of shirts, but showed just how rattled they had become. The creativity was infectious. There were officers who crafted heads out of plaster and attached them to long sticks, holding them up in the roll call line to cover for missing men. There were men who hid inside tea chests, wooden crates, and even inside a hollowed-out section of a bench in the courtyard, waiting there for 2 days without food or water for the right moment to make a run. The castle was full of hidden compartments. If you tapped on a wall in Colditz, it might sound hollow, because behind it was a radio room where prisoners listened to the BBC news, or a workshop where they were forging passports. The Germans tried to crack down. They increased the number of roll calls. They installed microphones in the ground to detect digging. They conducted surprise searches, tearing the rooms apart. But the prisoners had an answer for everything. When the guards came to search, the prisoners would organize impromptu concerts or riots to create noise and confusion, allowing others to hide the contraband. They set up a network of lookouts known as stooges. These men were stationed at every corner and staircase, using a complex system of hand signals to track the movement of every single German in the castle. If a guard known as a ferret entered the prisoner block, a signal would go down the line, and within seconds, all illegal maps, radios, and tools would vanish into secret hides. The prisoners knew where the Germans were better than the Germans knew themselves. This cat-and-mouse game created a strange relationship between the captors and the captives. The Germans began to view the British officers with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. They were dealing with men who treated imprisonment as a university education in sabotage. And as the war turned against Germany, the ambition of the prisoners grew. They were no longer satisfied with sneaking out one by one. They wanted to do something spectacular. They wanted to prove that the Aryan superiority was a myth and that British ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. This ambition led to the wildest idea of the entire war. It started as a joke in the canteen, a whisper between 2 engineers. What if we don't go under the walls? What if we don't go through the wire? What if we simply fly away? The idea of building an airplane inside a prison sounds like the delusion of men who have been locked up for too long. But at Colditz, the line between madness and genius had long since blurred. The concept was proposed by 2 British officers, Bill Goldfinch and Jack Best. Goldfinch was a civil engineer, and Best was an engineer with a talent for improvisation. They looked at the chapel roof, which had a long ridge obscured from the view of the German sentries in the courtyard. They calculated that if they could build a glider, launch it from that roof, and use a catapult system to give it initial speed, they could glide over the River Mulde and land in a meadow outside the town. From there, 2 men could escape. But the logistical challenges were insane. They needed to build a full-size 2-man aircraft with a wingspan of nearly 10 meters, capable of carrying the weight of 2 grown men, without the Germans seeing it, hearing it, or finding the materials. And they had to do it in an attic that was constantly patrolled. The project was codenamed the Colditz Cock. They found a secret workshop in the attic above the chapel. To hide it, they built a false wall. This was not just a sheet of cardboard. They built a sturdy wooden partition and covered it with plaster made from crushed debris and water, rubbing it with dust to make it look centuries old. Behind this wall, the factory began. The materials they used are a testament to human ingenuity. For the main spars of the wings, they stole floorboards. Every time the Germans weren't looking, a prisoner would pry up a floorboard from the sleeping quarters. They used hundreds of them. For the skin of the glider, they used prison sleeping bags made of blue and white checked cotton. They had to stitch these together by hand, creating a fabric that was light but strong. But how do you make the fabric airtight so it can generate lift? You need dope, a type of lacquer used in aviation. They didn't have dope. So they boiled down the millet soup served by the prison kitchen. The starch in the millet, when boiled into a paste and painted onto the cotton, shrank the fabric tight and sealed the pores. The entire glider was literally held together by soup. For the control wires to move the rudder and ailerons, they stole electrical wiring from unused parts of the castle. The construction took months. They worked in silence, terrified that the sound of a saw or a hammer would alert the guards below. They had a dedicated team of lookouts known as the Stooge Network, who watched the German patrols like hawks. If a guard approached the attic stairs, a signal was flashed, and the work stopped instantly. The glider was built in sections, the wings, the fuselage, the tail, so that it could be assembled quickly on the night of the launch. The engineering was surprisingly advanced. Goldfinch calculated the lift-to-drag ratios and the stress loads using a slide rule he had made himself. They built a launching system that used a bathtub filled with concrete as a counterweight. The plan was to drop the bathtub down a shaft, and the falling weight would pull a rope that would catapult the glider off the roof at 50 kilometers per hour. It was a suicide mission in many ways. If the calculations were wrong, the glider would stall and crash into the courtyard 75 feet below, instantly killing the pilots. As the Allied armies advanced into Germany in 1945, the atmosphere in the castle changed. The SS took over control from the regular army. There were rumors that Hitler had ordered the execution of all the Prominente prisoners, the VIPs held at Colditz, as a final act of vengeance. The glider was no longer just an escape vehicle, it was a lifeboat. The prisoners prepared for the worst. They armed themselves with homemade weapons and prepared to storm the gates if the SS tried to carry out a massacre. The glider remained hidden behind its false wall, ready to carry 2 men out to warn the approaching Americans. In the end, the American army arrived just in time. On April 16, 1945, the tanks of the US 9th Armored Division rolled into the town of Colditz. The castle was liberated without the glider ever having to fly. The German guards surrendered to the very men they had tried to keep in cages. When the American soldiers entered the castle, the British officers proudly took them up to the attic. They smashed down the false wall and revealed their secret masterpiece. The Americans were stunned. There, in the dusty gloom of a prison attic, sat a fully functional aircraft. It was sleek, beautiful, and terrifying. It was the ultimate symbol of the prisoners' victory. They hadn't just survived the war. They had mentally outclassed their captors. The Germans had spent 5 years guarding the doors and the gates, obsessing over locks and keys, while the British were upstairs building an air force. The glider was taken out and assembled for photographs. One American soldier sat in the cockpit, marveling at the controls. Unfortunately, in the chaos of the liberation, the glider was never flown and was eventually destroyed for firewood or souvenirs, a tragic end for such a magnificent machine. However, decades later, a team of aviation experts and engineers decided to test the legend. They built an exact replica of the Colditz cock using the same materials and the original plans drawn by Bill Goldfinch. They launched it from the roof of the castle in a televised experiment, and it flew. It soared perfectly over the castle walls and landed safely in the field across the river. The math was correct. The plan would have worked. This confirmation cemented the legacy of Colditz. It proved that the German failure was absolute. They had constructed a fortress of stone and fear, designed to break the will of the men inside. Instead, they had forged a brotherhood of defiance. The glider stands as the enduring image of this defiance, a refusal to accept reality as it is dictated by a tyrant, and the courage to invent a new reality, even if you have to build it out of floorboards and soup. It showed that while you can imprison a man's body, you cannot imprison his imagination. And in the contest between totalitarian bureaucracy and free-thinking creativity, creativity will always find a way to fly. The story of Colditz is not merely a collection of war anecdotes. It is a case study in the fragility of control. The Nazis believed that power came from suppression. They thought that if they built the walls high enough, counted the prisoners often enough, and threatened them with enough violence, they could extinguish the spark of resistance. They were wrong. Every restriction they imposed only fueled the prisoners' innovation. Every new lock bred a new key. Every new rule inspired a new way to break it. When we look back at the hollowed-out attics, the tunnels under the chapel, and that silent glider waiting in the dark, we see something more than just escape attempts. We see the total humiliation of a regime that took itself too seriously. The British officers didn't just want to leave. They wanted to win. They treated their imprisonment as a grand game, a duel of wits where the prize was their dignity. By laughing at their captors, by outsmarting them with cardboard generals and papier-mâché dummies, they stripped the Nazis of their power. They proved that a free mind is a weapon that no amount of concrete can disarm. Today, as we witness new empires trying to impose their will through fear and force, the lesson of Colditz resonates with powerful clarity. Tyrants always underestimate the resilience of those they try to subjugate. They rely on the dull machinery of obedience, while free people rely on the boundless capacity of the human spirit to invent, to adapt, and to endure. The castle still stands on its cliff in Saxony, a silent monument to this truth. But the empire that built it is gone, turned to dust by history. The spirit of the men who built wings in an attic, however, lives on. It reminds us that even in the darkest of prisons, when all hope seems lost and the walls seem insurmountable, there is always a way out. Sometimes you have to dig deep into the earth, and sometimes you have to build a glider and fly. If you enjoyed this story of ingenuity and defiance, please leave a like and subscribe to Indomitable History. And tell me in the comments, if you were locked in Colditz, would you have joined the tunnelers, or would you have risked it all on the glider? Until next time, keep your spirit indomitable.